Welcome to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I painted this parrot step by step, and we will practice all the different techniques that you can use to make your bird painting more realistic. From a color map underpainting to different blending techniques and feather strokes to one little trick that I use on the eyes that always makes the bird look more alive. We will also discuss the concept of color temperature and how we can use warmer greens that contain a lot of yellow for our highlights, and also cooler, darker greens with more blue undertones for our shadows. I hope this video brightens up your day with some color. It's just way too cold and snowy in Canada. All I can see all day is white, and I really wanted to immerse myself in some bright tropical greens and reds, so this is how the composition was born. And another thing you will notice is these bright pink tulips surrounding the parrot, and I first fell in love with them while working on the silver dollar coin that I designed for the Royal Canadian Mint. I originally rendered the tulips in black and white so they can be engraved in silver, and the shape of the petals captivated me so much. I wanted to recreate it with you in watercolor. So I will show you exactly how I painted the tulips in the next week's video, so don't forget to subscribe. For today, let's focus on the parrot and break it down step by step, following the process you may already be familiar with if you've seen any of my previous videos. We will start with a very light underpainting, mapping out our main color areas wet on wet. In the second definition layer, we will paint the main shadow areas under the neck and under the wings, also the tail feathers. There is one technique that I will introduce at this point, and this is very useful for birds, animals, or anything with fur and texture. Instead of blending with clear water, we will start blending with tiny strokes, just like this, helping the shadow colors extend into the highlight by creating these very detailed cascades of feathers. As always, we will do an accent layer and go over the shadow areas one more time, building more contrast in values or lights and darks, adding more texture. All materials and the link to reference photo is in the video description below, and if you want to paint along with me in real time, the full tutorial along with the black and white outlines is on my Patreon. A couple of notes before we start: you will see me using all sorts of green pigments straight from the tube, but this is for convenience only. You can mix all of these shades of green by using a handful of single pigments. If you want to do a refresh on painting and mixing greens, I recommend watching this video where I go in depth on the topic of different green palettes and mixes. So if you're ready, get your greens and reds, maybe some indigo, and let's get started. So let's start by painting the top part of the bird. Working wet and wet, meaning wet paint into wet paper. You can either start by pre-wetting the area of the chest with clear water, or I'm going to show you what I normally do is start with a very light color. And the reason why I do this for wet into wet is because I want to see the borders of the area I'm working on. It's much harder when you just have clear water. Sometimes I forget to cover certain areas, so I like to add a little bit of my initial color, just like I did here with my Phthalo Yellow Green. And the key for this step is to keep your paint so light. And let's cover this whole area, so the chest, the belly, the wings. And as you start approaching the right hand side, so the top area on his wing, switch to your lighter bluish green so you can see the contrast there. Areas eventually will be in the shadow. Right now, just use a little bit of color for some very basic color mapping. And just like you did on the wing on the right, we want some bluish green right under his neck. So as you can see, we're mapping out some larger areas of green, from warm yellowish green to cooler bluish green, but overall everything is so light. So keep it so watery, like lots and lots of water. You can always add more color later on, but you might have trouble lifting color. So lifting is possible but never ideal because it disturbs the paper. As an entirely optional step, but a step that I add with purpose because it not only fits my style but also adds a lot of visual interest, I'm gonna drop a little bit of my purple. Just little tiny drops, mostly underneath his chest. So that's gonna create some nice shadow definition while adding visual interest. Let's move down and work on the next block of color. So everything underneath the stem and the legs. And here I'm working very carefully with the tip of my brush, trying not to get into the area that I want to keep blank. And I'm just going to use my main green, carry that shadow down, that shadow that I started under the wing. And you can add a little bit of your yellowish green. We're seeing the feathers sort of under the wing. And just like on the tail, they appear to be a little bit warmer. So there's some logic to the way the colors appear on the bird. And the chest and the top of the wings, also the back of his head, are a lot cooler overall compared to the inside of the wings and the tail. Let's finish off this triangular shape that completes his body, and that's where the body ends and the tail feathers start. And now let's work on the tail. And notice that overall the tail feathers are a lot warmer. So I'm going to start with my green gold, and you can simply mix a warm yellow with your medium green. Keep it light and heavier on the yellow if you're mixing your own green. And let's cover the first cluster of feathers. Maybe leave a few thin white strips in the middle of the feathers. Those are the bases of the feather, and from there we can work on some details later on. Now let's work on the head of the parrot, and I'm going to show you up close how I'm gonna go about it. So we want to start off with our main yellow green and go very carefully around the beak and around the eye and continue out. What we want to do is create a nice transition from warmer light greens to cooler bluish greens. And so as I reach about halfway, I'm gonna switch to my Phthalo Green Blue Shade, and as I mentioned in the beginning, just add a little bit more of blue into your main green here if you don't have that specific pigment, or you can even go in straight with Phthalo Blue, but I'm gonna use that intermediate step and then finish off with my Phthalo Blue Green Shade. So you can see here the transition from warm to cool greens is a lot more obvious, and I'm gonna blend up on top with damp clean brush to make sure we're leaving enough room for highlight. And that's about it for the first layer on the head. I'm gonna come back and maybe drop a little bit more of my main green in the shadow areas closer to the beak. Grab your orange or warm red. I used my Winsor Orange Red shade, and you can also reuse the same color as you used on the neck ring. I used Quinacridone Coral. It's nice to have some variation, but it's not necessary. And the next ring I'm going to paint is blue, so I'm just reusing my Phthalo Blue. And the next thing on the bird's head is that beautiful dark ring of feathers that creates a beautiful contrast, and it does look like it's the darkest part of the parrot. However, as I always mention, it's best not to use black because it looks unnatural and too kind of harsh. So I went with my indigo, which is the darkest blue I have. You switch to a smaller brush here if you need to, because what we want to do is paint this ring by applying very thin small strokes in the direction of the feathers, so from the eye and out, instead of painting a solid line. That would give us a better sense of realism and texture and help us create better and more smooth, more realistic color transitions. So you can see I'm following the line, but instead of just applying one large stroke, I'm doing these tiny little strokes on top and at the bottom, getting a little bit into the previously painted green areas. Now let's work on the beak. I'm using Quinacridone Coral and blending with a clean damp brush. You can transition to a cooler, more bluish red as you move down, where the shadows are more pronounced, all the way to the tip of the beak. And we end with cooler red. You can also add some indigo on the tip very carefully. Don't let it spread too far. We will have an opportunity to come back and finesse this section. And then you can use the same indigo to paint the final inside ring. And in the reference photo, there is no white highlight, but it always helps to paint around a small white highlight if you can with the tip of your brush, or you can add it later on with some white gouache. It simply helps create a better shape by marking that light reflection. Let's work on the second layer of the bird, and we are roughly here, as you can see, and we're going to work on defining our areas of light and shadow and arrive at something that looks like this. So much more realistic, a lot more detail, a lot more dimension. And I'm going to start by working on the tail. The technique is very simple here. Just grab your brownish warm green, and let's start with the shadow areas on the feather. Put down your color and then blend down with clear water. If you want, you can add a little bit of your cooler green, your bluish green, on the tip, and the same way blend with clear water, but this time blend it up. There is a very distinct shadow in between two cascades of feathers that eventually meet in the middle. So I'm going to again put down my sap green, blend with clear water, and continue blending. Note that I'm still keeping my paint quite light, so maybe a few steps darker than the first layer, but still overall I'm not reaching the full saturation. Let's move up to the body of the bird and switch to our medium green and then to our cooler bluish green, as we're doing the same thing, adding definition to our shadows. And I'm gonna work once again wet on dry, put down my color, and then I'm gonna blend with clear water into the body of the bird. Let's finish this section by adding some hooker's green on the left hand side, moving all the way up to the neck, and then you can switch to your blue. I'm gonna switch to my Phthalo Blue Green shade right under his head on the neck, and maybe mix it with my main yellow green. You can see I'm adding very thin light strokes. You can blend with clear water into the white space or use this technique of just very thin strokes, carrying the paint up and down. Now, as my paint is drying out, I'm gonna add even stronger shadow in that same area under the wing. Make sure to blend with clear water into the chest of the bird. Let's do the same thing in those shadow areas that we've painted in the beginning. More saturated dark blue-green. You can use perylene green or add indigo to your main green or add indanthrone blue. I left a list of alternatives in the video description. You can use purple. The point is make it darker, bluer, more saturated, and then blend up with your hooker's green and eventually with clear water into the chest of the bird. As we move to the right, I'm going to switch to our bluish green once again, just like in our underpainting, but a few shades darker. Let's do this on the left. The left wing, we see sort of the inside of it, and the shadow there is much more pronounced. And I'm going to do something a little bit different. Into my main green, I'm going to drop a little bit of my perylene violet, and you can substitute it with your purple or brown. But the point is, it's very close to one of the flowers, that shadow. And I want to now start sort of moving away from the photo reference and closer to my vision for this composition and building a more cohesive palette by recycling my colors. So if I used some reds and purples on the flower, I want to also have those colors on the bird in those areas that are close to the flower. It's going to keep the overall composition more cohesive. Okay, so the body of the bird is done as far as our definition layer, and it's time to work on the head of the bird. Let's start with the beak, and all we need is just one layer of more saturated color. You can go in with the same color as you did before, just a few steps darker. Reds are very tricky to paint with for one specific reason. They may not look very dark at full saturation, but they actually, if you switch to a black and white view, appear almost completely black at full saturation. So it's very important to start super light, which is why we started with a light underpainting when you're working with reds. And I have an entire tutorial on working with reds, but essentially they're very deceiving in terms of values. So always start a little bit lighter than you think you need to, and that is what we did in the first layer. Now we can add those details using fully saturated red. I want to add a little bit more detail on those dark areas. Again, just using your darkest blue color. I'm using indigo. You can see the logic is the same. I'm using very thin strokes, just the tip of my brush, to get into those green areas a little bit. So create a bit of a jagged edge, and I'm following the direction of the feathers always when using these thin strokes. When you paint birds, to add realistic texture, always keep your brush following the direction of the feathers, and on the head and the neck and the chest, typically it's from the eye and out towards the rest of the body. A little bit more saturation now on that lighter reddish orange ring. The final step for the second layer of the bird is the head. And here I'm going to zoom in very closely so you can see what I'm doing. If you recall, when we were painting the chest of the bird a few minutes ago, I mentioned that you can do it two ways. You can put down the color and blend it with clear water to create more defined shadows, or you can use this sort of in-between solution of putting the tiniest strokes, and from far away it will create an illusion of solid shadow. But if you look up close, it's much more realistic because the shadow is built using tiny strokes of color on top of the previously painted layer. So notice that I put a lot of blue along the dark indigo ring. My coverage is a lot more dense there, so from far away it will look like a solid shadow, and you have a lot more control that way, and you're leaving a lot more interesting highlights. It's not necessary, it's simply a more nuanced approach to painting feathers. The last step of the second layer is the legs, and we're going to be using primarily our darker blue. So at minimum, just grab your darkest color, your indigo if you're using the same palette as me, or can be Payne's gray, and zoom in on your reference photo. Let's outline the shapes, and where possible, if your brush allows it, add some variation in values, meaning lights and darks, by adding a little bit of water. And here's our second layer. You can see much more realistic compared to the first underpainting map of color that we've created. Let's let this layer dry completely before we finish the bird. We have only one layer of color left, and I call this the accent layer because for the most part at this stage we have the overall map of color and we have our main shadow areas defined, our highlights stand out. So what we can do is accentuate some of the shadows and add lots of texture, which for the bird will be very important because we can define some feathers a lot further, starting with the tail feathers. And here for the shadow areas, I've pre-mixed a little bit of my dioxazine purple with my main green. So I find that for this particular composition, purple is sort of holding the overall composition together by appearing in different parts, and because it's a transparent, beautiful transparent color, it mixes very well with the greens on the bird. And here, working with the tip of my brush, I'm just accentuating the shadow areas on the feathers and painting tiny lines in the direction of the feather to mark up the texture. So I'm just getting first into the shadow area, painting the overall shape of the shadow, like in the darkest parts. Mostly it's underneath each feather, and that's called negative painting, meaning we're painting around an object instead of on the object. So we're painting the shadows, and by doing that, we're helping the lighter feathers stand out visually, and then we're blending our dark green purple mixture with clear water with a damp brush. As we move up to the body of the bird, let's use our cooler greens, and here I'm just using Phthalo Green Blue Shade. You can simply use your medium base green, add some blue into it if you want, and again working wet on dry and using negative painting technique, let's paint around the highlights on the feathers, creating some natural curved shapes all around the edge of that area and maybe a little bit under the feet of the bird. On the right, this leg has a very defined, very visible bunch of feathers, and I want to leave the underpainting area up on top completely dry and paint around it, again using the same bluish green, adding more value to the shadow. But now, as you can see, I'm not blending with clear water, I'm adding very thin strokes, helping that darker pigment fade into the background and defining some very thin strands right above the leg. I'm going to continue working with my bluish green on the main shadows, now adding more value on the left, but also adjusting the temperature. And this is what watercolor glazing is all about. We can continue adding layers and layers of color, adjusting the values and temperature, and by making the overall green a bit cooler on the body of the bird, we're differentiating the warmer yellowish feathers of the tail and the inside of the wing. And again, you can blend with clear water into the lighter area of the bird, or you can use this thin stroke technique and just help the color recede into the highlight by extending it and using these very thin, fast strokes. Some blue on the right hand side. Again, in that area we started with bluish green, we're adding more blue green. So essentially we're just working on the same areas that we've covered with paint in the second layer, but now a little bit smaller and more deliberate, more concentrated, accentuating the shadows. And by doing that, our highlights are popping a little bit more. I'm simplifying quite a bit, so I'm only capturing the main shapes based on what I see in the reference photo and only adding as much as the size of my painting allows me to add and the tip of my brush. Once again, notice that my strokes are creating these half moon semicircle shapes, somewhat similar to what we did with the partridge. If you followed that tutorial, the logic is the same. The feathers create semicircles on the chest of the bird. They were much more visible on the partridge. Here they're a little bit less visible, so I'm using a lighter touch. But as I'm creating texture, I'm simply being very careful to point my brush in the direction of the feathers, being careful not to overpaint. I'm creating some realistic texture. So here we go, the very last, my final few strokes on the bird. Just a little bit more of that vibrant green, only on the shadow area of the face. And I'm gonna blend with clear water. And this is only because I feel like I need a little bit more vibrancy there to balance out the colors. A little bit of my darker main blue in the shadow areas, wet into wet, and I'm gonna spread the colors into the highlights using maybe a lighter phthalo blue. Let's say that's it. The parrot is done, and I will see you in the next part of this tutorial where we're gonna work on the tulips. We're gonna start from the beginning and work all the way up to the third layer and then do the stem and the leaves. Thank you for watching and painting with me. I will see you in the next tutorial.